What I truly love about what Explore Mars and the Human to Mars Summit does is that we just have some fantastic friends and colleagues who come and share such, I don't know, mind-blowing, groundbreaking work. So it just every year just gets better and better. But please welcome to the stage, his name is Jim Mazur. He is the Senior Vice President of Rocketdyne. And I said, how can I introduce you? And he says, I just basically say what my job description is, technically all things space. And I was like, you got it. So this is Jim Mazur, who's the Senior Vice President of Rocketdyne, all things space. But I did read on his LinkedIn profile that he demonstrates the ability to improve performance in complex operating environments, which I'm going to think means he gets along or has to work, and that's how he works out things with Joe Cassidy. So without further ado, with those complex environments over there, please welcome to the stage, Jim Mazur. Come on out.
Thanks, Dennis. Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here. I understand you guys have had a good week, and it's really fun to come here and talk about the big picture because lots of times I spend time talking cash flow with our CFO, or we have solar electric propulsion we're doing on the DART mission, and it's going to be on the power and propulsion element for Gateway. And I was in a conversation last week about whether the metallization for the brazing process on a cathode was right. So I think it's really good to step back and talk about the big picture and what we're talking about going to the moon, to Mars. So I think that's really exciting. And it's also a lot of fun to really think about why we're in this business and what we're doing. I'll give you a quick background. I started in the 80s when Reagan was president, and I got put to work with McDonnell Douglas working on Star Wars satellites, and they were the precursor to missile defense, but we designed, built, and launched 3 satellites in 6 years. So I got hooked on kind of rapid prototype development and going fast. And then I worked Delta 1, 2, 3, and the architecture for Delta 4, became chief engineer of Delta 3, and then I moved to chief engineer of a company called Sea Launch, which was an international joint venture, Russian, Ukrainian, Norwegian Americans launching communication satellites from a converted oil drilling platform off the equator. And then I became president of that company, and then in 2006, I went and became president and chief operating officer of SpaceX. And then I got offered a job later in 2006 to go run Rocketdyne and become part of human spaceflight. So moving from expendable commercial rockets into human spaceflight was challenging, exciting for me, but I really wanted to be part of that environment. And that's why we're here today, because it's ultimately about the human space flight. And then we got bought by Aerojet Rocketdyne. And after 30 years in the space business, what was going on was, in that time frame, Constellation had been canceled. We said, why are we going back to the moon? We don't need to go there anymore. And let's go lasso an asteroid and bring it back and figure out what to do with it. And I remember I was at NASA headquarters in a meeting with a lot of industry, and I raised my hand, and I was like in that movie Big, you know, I go, I don't get it. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, how does all this help us get to Mars? And they're like, well, we just told you. And I'm like, I don't get it. So I decided I was going to go be a jet engine guy because I thought, you know, maybe there's a more rational part of the aerospace business. I ended up running the F-135 engine program. But I didn't like it. I was commuting from California to Hartford, and I found I wasn't passionate about it. So I had the opportunity to come back and get into the space business with Aerojet Rocketdyne. I'm happy to be back, and I'm really thrilled to be here with you guys today. One of the things I think about, though, when I tell that story, when I think about going to the moon and to Mars, I want to talk about some of the elements that will be required. And the first thing, at least the lessons I think we've learned, is what I'm calling constancy of purpose. And I think about when we first went to the moon, we had a showing, we sponsored a showing at the National Air and Space Museum on Apollo 11, and it was great seeing that. And I was on a panel afterwards, and we were talking about how inspirational it was. And for me, I was 8 years old when we landed on the moon, and it was inspirational. But when we did all that, I think we all had a view that we were going to continue to move on. We'd have a constancy of purpose, right? We went to the moon. The next thing we decided to do was do low Earth orbit with the space station. But I always thought there'd be low Earth orbit with space station, and part of the model would be low Earth orbit with space station. We'd go to the moon, establish sustainability in low Earth orbit in the moon, and then use that to move on to Mars. And I'm sure in the 70s, when I was still in grade school, that we all thought we'd be on Mars by now. And I think we'd be a lot further along if we had some constancy of purpose, and also if we had reliable budgets. And I don't think it has to be a lot, but it just has to be dependable and not shifting around. So I think in order to ensure the vision, if we really want to get to Mars, going forward, we have to have constancy of purpose and not have starts and stops. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. And then when I think about LEO, ISS, the moon, and Mars, then I also think about, okay, what's the roadmap over time? You have constancy of purpose. Okay, you get that, which means you want to keep going. But what are you going to do? How are you going to get there? Who's going to do what? What are you going to do? In what order? And what are the roles and responsibilities wrapped around that? And how's it going to get paid for? And what's your operational model? And so my position is when you look at the complexity of this, and I think you guys have all been talking about it, you have academia, international, commercial, industrial, governmental, and I think out of all of that, NASA leadership is critical to getting us to a near-term sustainable presence on the moon that feeds forward to Mars. And I think that overall model then that I had in my head, and I think a lot of us had, is that NASA working internationally and working with academia and industry would establish the low Earth presence and ideally find a way to transition it to commercial operation. And that's still what we're trying to do today. I wouldn't say it's entirely there. We certainly have what we call commercial cargo going there, and we're working hard on commercial crew. It hasn't been as easy to get to low Earth orbit as we thought it would be, but we're moving in that direction. And I know there's a model of ideally let low Earth orbit and a sustainable presence there ultimately be sustained by commercial activity. And then the next step is to basically have sustainable activity on the moon. And as you do that, we're going to partner with commercial to get there, cargo, maybe with crew. I think the ascent module is going to be a lot more complicated, just like crew to station is. But you do that and see if you can establish the infrastructure for commercial use and commercial business on there. And then NASA focuses on the next thing, what's going to Mars, either a moon of Mars or Mars itself. So every way, NASA is pushing the bounds of the frontier, and as the infrastructure and capability is made available, commercial can come in and utilize it. To me, I think that's a really good model, and I think it can work well. And the other thing is that ties with the international partners, the academic partners, and the industrial partners. So a lot of what I like to talk about is some people say, well, maybe NASA should go away and it should be all commercial. I think the answer is it's not NASA or commercial or NASA or international, it's and. I think it all plays together really well. But I think, when Kennedy said we were going to go to the moon, he said, we choose to do these things not because they're easy, but because they're hard, because that will serve to organize and energize the best of our energies and skills. And I think that's exactly what it does. And I think when we're looking to do the hard stuff, I think it's their job to push the boundaries of the frontier. There was a group that gets together regularly, but on the 6th Community Achievability and Sustainability of Human Exploration in Mars Workshop, AM6, in 2018, they concluded that a successful Moon to Mars human spacecraft flight program requires a single integrating authority with budget control to emphasize the synergistic results of technology operations, science, and trade studies, and that lunar and Martian priorities should not be assessed independently. And so that's where I think if you're looking for an integrating organization, I think that's why NASA exists, to do the hard stuff, to integrate, and to pave the way for the rest of the world. And then they can create the roadmap. The roadmap is done in a vacuum, right? We're all providing inputs, and we all have kind of our biased inputs too. I know from a rocket propulsion standpoint, launch propulsion and in-space propulsion, we have a lot of ideas and inputs. We're doing architectural trades, and we're going in and arguing for what we think the best case is. So is everybody else. We all know that. People are announcing architectures they have. People are announcing the technology they're developing. It's good because people are investing in technology. We have competing ideas, but at some point it's got to be integrated together into an architecture and a roadmap. And there can be parallel technology developments, but as that all works together, we want to constantly move forward and develop the technology we need to go in the direction we're going. And one of the things I also think about is, I definitely think of the people providing inputs. I don't really believe that Congress or OMB or any single individual should be defining how we go to moon and feed forward to Mars. I think it has to be integrated together. I think their ideas are great, but it's not any one approach, and it's an and approach. But the other thing I want to think about is the strong attention to the timeline and the budget. So I think when we talk about 2024, we want to talk about, in my mind, that's so soon, who's on the critical path. And you don't have a lot of time for technology development. So we really want to get there by 2024. My experience in the commercial world and the real world is to do technology on the side, and we call it technology insertion, spiraled evolution, whatever you want to call it, but you go get the job done with the technology you have and can depend on between now and 2024. If you put significant technology development on the critical path, history has shown, at least, it's very difficult to get it ready in time to go because typically you have challenges and learnings. We should be developing that technology, but try and keep technology or any part of the architecture off the critical path so we can get there by 2024. I think that's absolutely essential. And then also the budget. NASA's budget is they just went in with an amendment, so say it's hovered between $18 and $20 billion for a long time. Now we're talking about an amendment. It might be up to maybe 22, 23 billion, 20. In my mind, that's way different than the defense budget, by the way. Defense budget for the United States is on the order of 750 billion. So if you ask the average American what the NASA budget was versus the defense budget, they'd probably say about the same, or, and it's clearly not. But the thing is that's the reality. Maybe we need a little bit more, but we can still, if we have constancy of purpose, we understand the budget we're going to get year after year, we can lay out the plans and achieve that. And that's where the partnering with everybody else to get all the resources pooled together provides an advantage. The other thing, I think the other point I want to make is that you have constancy of purpose, you have a roadmap, you have roles and responsibilities, and you have aggressive goals. And that's what I think's really important. That's what was so, what I would say, inspirational about Apollo 11. There was the Apollo program in general, there was constancy of purpose and there were aggressive goals. And aggressive goals can be very invigorating, very exciting, very aspirational, and very inspirational to bring people who want to come into this industry and actually see something meaningful happen in their lifetimes, and actually, ideally, within your first 10 years in the industry. I saw the first satellite I worked on launched probably 2 years after I started. The third satellite I worked on launched 6 years after I started. So just, to me, that was very rewarding, and getting, kind of that, not having to wait decades or a lifetime to see something you're working on pay off. I think that ties back to aggressive goals and aggressive timelines, and it also drives innovation. So when you're challenged with that, that's when you get the creative thinking, and that's when you can be innovative. And I absolutely believe 2024 will drive innovation and will drive excitement and will attract more people to the industry. And then I think the next aggressive goal, I don't know what you guys have talked about this week, but I think 2033 is what I've been reading is what might be the earliest opportunity to put humans on Mars. And I think most people are saying, and there's a report out saying that can't happen. I think that's an aggressive goal, and if we really wanted to, we could make it happen. So I'm very much a believer in aggressive goals, but I also am a believer in realistic goals. So there's got to be some level of reality, and just because someone tweets it doesn't make it true. So it's got to be achievable at some level. And I say that seriously because I remember as the industry was getting shaken up, I'd be talking to different reporters and columnists, and I'd say, I understand what's being said, but the physics don't support that and the timeline doesn't support it. It's just not reality. And they said basically, Jim, nobody finds your reality exciting. And so I've had a lot of thinking about that, and I don't know the answer to that, but it's got to be aspirational, it's got to be aggressive, but to me it's got to be achievable. Otherwise, strategy without execution is hallucination. So the next element I think is really important is risk, and we're not talking about all that much, but I think we got to get aligned around as we go to the moon and we feed forward to Mars and we integrate together and we try and enable and help commercial leverage infrastructure and be part of all this activity. What level of risk can we accept? Right? When I was a jet engine guy, when a fighter went down and a fighter pilot died, it was considered a bad day. When an astronaut dies, it's a national crisis. And so are we going to continue on that path? Are we going to be willing to accept risks? Will we accept risks until something bad happens? We got to get aligned around that because that feeds directly into the roadmaps we have, the timeline, how aggressive we can be, and our willingness to take risks because you only learn in advance by taking risks and having failures. Now, failures, in my mind, doesn't mean people die. Failures, ideally, people survive and you learn from it, but you can make mistakes. But I think we got to get aligned around what level of risk is acceptable if we're going to operate in a model that integrates all of these different constituencies together. And then finally, the technology to back the roadmap for sustainable feed forward. I'm sure you guys have been talking about it all week. Gateway is going to be, right now it's going to start off as sort of they call it slimmed down gateway. It's going to be a small space station in near rectilinear halo orbit. It took me forever to learn that when I came back. With solar electric propulsion, we're building the solar electric propulsion for that now. But it's pretty high power. Nothing that high power has been built. So we've been working hard on developing it, and we got to produce our flight propulsion for SEP, which should get awarded for PPE, which should get awarded ideally this month, is what we're hearing. Landers and ascent vehicles. So in 2024, we've been kind of looking at, if you want to land and you want to use existing technology, we know how to do it with storable propulsion. We actually know how to do it with hydrogen too, but it's not clear to me that we've got the cryo storage capabilities for hydrogen and that we've developed all of that to be reliably done by 2024. I think that would have to be looked hard at. We have an RL-10 engine that's flown over 500 times, and we've throttled that down to 10%. We did it in the early 2000s to demonstrate it for lander technology. I think hydrogen might be the ultimate technology for payload capability, but in the near term, our studies show that storable would be, if you're going to put it on critical path, that we understand that technology in terms of long duration and getting to the moon much better, but those trades will be done. And that's what it gets back to, and other people talk about methane, and then you get into what's our in situ resource utilization. Are we going to take water from the moon and turn it into LOX and hydrogen? What kind of power will that take to do it on the moon? Surface power, how are we going to do all that? Cryo transfer, we want reusability, right? So the idea behind a sustainable presence is to have reusability. Part of reusability then is to take the vehicles we've put on the gateway or take vehicles we're landing on the moon and fill them back up and keep reusing them over and over again. And we need to develop the capability of that. We need to develop propellant transfer capabilities. All of those have to fit in. And then you talk about especially as you're going to Mars, what are you going to use for surface power? And likely solar is probably going to be challenging there. It'll have to be supplemented by some sort of nuclear power. We've been working on nuclear surface power for a long time. How much autonomy do you need? When you think about it, I got to look this up. I can't keep it in my head, but low Earth orbit is 200 miles for International Space Station. The moon is 238,000 miles, and Mars is 140 million miles. So part of the idea is as you get further and further away, we want to learn how to operate at a distance of 140 million miles away while we're 238,000 miles away, in my opinion, because that's where you can practice these things. You're only a few days away from Earth. From a communication standpoint, it's much faster. Round trip comms just from Mars to Earth and back, if you're asking a question and it has to be answered, is probably on the order of 30 minutes going both ways. So how much autonomy do you need on Mars to sustain? And when you're getting to Mars, how are you going to get there? I think everyone's generally thinking cargo first and then human second. Cargo, you can use electric propulsion to take cargo out there. because you can take more time and you want to take as much mass as possible, probably 20,000 kilogram loads at a time. Probably need 4 of them before you even send humans there. Send all that in advance, and then humans, the last panel I heard them talking about that, for all those considerations, radiation, isolation, microbes, all those things, you want to go as fast as possible. And the fastest way we know how right now is with nuclear thermal propulsion. We flew nuclear thermal propulsion rocket engine in the 60s, haven't flown one since, but we think it's time to talk about that if you really want to minimize the time to getting to Mars. And so when you sum all that up, it's really easy, right? Makes a lot of sense. But to me, that's what makes it exciting. And the thing I summarize with Apollo 11 is, as much as I love our history and I find it exciting, I'm more excited and more inspired and have higher aspirations for how we can leverage our history to doing what we're talking about here, going to the moon and feeding forward to Mars. And I definitely want to see both those happen in my lifetime. I don't think it's too late. So that's what I have. Thank you very much.